At any rate, welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. As I suggested in the Twitter announcement of what I wanted to talk about today, I want to talk about words, in part because, as ever, I'm really irritated at the way some words are being used this week. And I want to take a look at how that has played out over time. And once again, I checked before this episode. I looked through all of my notes. I have a file with just like notes for History Matters. And I was like, how many other times have I talked about words? It's like, I don't know, maybe 4 other times in different ways every time, which was a nice thing to see. However, again and again, I keep coming back to this, and I will come back to it. Yet before I plunge in, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will tell us the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie from New American History, and John has 2 announcements, or I asked John for these because I think they're important. September 24th is the NCHE Equity Summit. Put that on your calendar. And for those of you teachers who have not gone back to school yet and you're still joining us live or listening to this later, September 26th is the deadline to submit your proposals to present at the NCHE conference. So if you go to nche.org, you can find out lots of good info about both of those important deadlines. We are here today, as we are every Friday. I'm excited about this topic because we know history matters and words matter. So the rules of the game are mainly engage in the chat, which we know you love to do and you're doing already. But please, if you have questions, put the questions in the Q&A. If you have something that starts off with, this isn't a question, it probably should go in the chat.
Oh, and don't forget all participants, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. In the chat, if you don't change it, you're only talking to me, Joanne, and John.
And we like you, but I think other people would like to know what you're saying.
So switch it now to everyone and enjoy. We'll see you in a little while.
Excellent. Okay, here we go. So what launched me off on this, and I think I'm going to be on TV over the weekend talking about it because I tweeted about it, and then things like that happen. What really got me this week, it was people using the phrase Civil War. Now, years ago, I remember doing an interview with the BBC, a radio interview with the BBC, sitting right there. And it was early on in all of the chaos. And it's an American, here's an American historian telling us what it's like. And in a leading question, someone said to me, so it's like a civil war without the guns. And at the time, guns were a little less in the news. And I said, no, it's not like a civil war without the guns. I mean, that's rather extreme statement. Like that, there's a meaning there. You can't just toss that out. Now, interestingly, yesterday I was watching briefly some, I will not say where, but a cable news channel, and some commentator on cable news said something like, yes, basically we are in a civil war. No, we're not. No, we're not. But I think that that's important to recognize for reasons that perhaps are less obvious than might seem on the surface. And it's something I'm going to come back to, I think, at the end. But, you know, particularly if you're talking to Americans about Americans who had their own civil war, if you say, oh, we're in a civil war, you are instantly stamping it with the Civil War, right? Our Civil War of the past. This is a civil war. You cannot escape the fact that that brings with it a lot of baggage, a lot of political baggage, a lot of cultural baggage. It suggests there's 2 sides fighting against each other. It suggests a kind of both sidesism. That's what I tweeted about was, I don't know, Civil War feels to me like the ultimate both sides. No, this isn't some kind of formal warfare. This isn't 2 sides attacking each other in any way. You could call what's happening many things. One thing you could call it is, again, and we're talking specifically here about specific people, is extremist violence, right? We're seeing some of that, attempted violence and extremist violence. That's not what I would call civil war. that's uglier than civil war, even though a civil war is an ugly idea. If you're saying civil war, in a sense, you're glossing over the ugly undertow of some of what's going on. And you're hiding that undertow in what I would call a history mask. Civil war, yeah, that's it. So I think there are a lot of problems just with using that phrase, that we're in a civil war. We are not, but saying that we are suggests, first of all, that things aren't where they are, and makes it formal in a way it isn't, and makes it a kind of both sides argument, which right now it really isn't, right? We don't have both sides doing the same thing right now. We have some people resorting to, I said extremist violence. Someone responded to my tweet and said, I prefer militant violence because extremist could be on either side. I'm okay with militant violence, but it sure as heck isn't civil war. Another word that one could toss out, and this word is coded for Americans, so I don't necessarily think, I won't say we should, but one could also throw out into the world, depending on who and what you're talking about, the word terrorism. People who are trying to scare others into not doing things that are actually legal, allowable. Terrorism, I think for many Americans, is coded foreign. Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans do not like to brand domestic violent people as terrorists, although they are practicing terrorism. I think when you use that word, somehow or other, you're suggesting that we don't own what's going on. I think the same thing holds true when people use the word Nazi, right? Oh, on the right, they're Nazis. They're all a bunch of Nazis. It's all Nazism. I don't think that's very useful either, because once again, there's a history mask, right? If you say, oh, they're all Nazis, you're obviously thinking of actual Nazis, of something many, many decades ago, of people who had their own political ideas, as horrific as they are, and as foreign. What we're looking at now, when people say Nazi, that's not Nazis. There may be resemblance, but we own that. That's ours. Nazism kind of suggests that we've adopted something. No. So I don't like the use of Nazi either, because I think in a sense, it's almost, and this will sound ironic and counterintuitive, it's almost a comforting, like Civil War and Nazi are, bear with me here, in a counterintuitive way, comforting, because they allow you to take a step back. Oh, Nazis, we're talking about Nazis. Let's talk about that. Oh, Civil War, that's a big topic, and we've had one before. Extremist violence and white fascism, or whatever you want to call white supremacy, that's a lot uglier and that's a lot scarier than those two sort of historical bucket terms. So that's where I'm coming from in today's episode. That's what obviously has got me all stirred up. I think I'm going to be on Velshi Sunday morning talking about this, because obviously, and this I have said many, many, many times before on History Matters, words matter. Words matter a lot. Words not only define things, but they include and exclude things, they frame things, they suggest intent and motive. There are all kinds of ways in which seemingly innocent word choices are not that at all. Another example we've seen recently is use of the word raid for what happened in Florida. Now, you can use a lot of words for that, but raid suggests it was like this illegal attack. And, legally executed search warrant does not have zing. I will acknowledge. But raid has a lot of baggage attached to it. So, when we are using words, whether it's Nazi or Civil War or raid, we should be thinking about the baggage that goes along with it. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to appeal to that baggage to make a point, that's on you. But at least if you're doing that, do it aware that you're doing it and not unaware that you're doing it. Again, a continuing theme here on History Matters, which is think about words, think about the words that other people are using to stir you up, which we see all the time. Rage harvesting, I think, is a wonderful phrase. And think about the words you're using and really what you're saying and what you really intend to be saying, and if the words that you're choosing to use are saying that. words matter a lot. I remember when I was digging around looking to see other times when I spoke about words, I reminded myself of a quote from the antebellum Congress, from Congress like in 1858, in which a Southerner wrote to the Speaker of the House, who was a Northerner, a Republican, and begged him to tell his friend Republicans, these anti-slavery Northerners, to hold back from throwing missiles at Southerners. And by missiles, he meant words, the wrong words. And that to me is a wonderfully concise way of getting at what can be the power of words. We saw this before, actually, when we were talking about what happened on January 6th. Was it a riot? Was it an insurrection? Was it tourism? Was it a failed coup? Whatever. All of those things have different intonations, have different meanings, have different implications, right? And it matters, right? If it's an insurrection, that has a kind of semi-righteous tone beneath it that failed coup really does not. So all of these things matter. I'm not going to tell you what words to use, but I am going to tell you to think about them. Now, in looking back and thinking about things in the past that could inform us about this, and I will say, actually, before I plunge into that, because I will, among other things, the word terrorism is going to come up. I did look up, for the purposes of our conversation this morning, how civil war is routinely defined. And in a sense, this shouldn't be surprising to you, is that people argue about the definition of civil war. Why? Because it matters, right? So some people, and all of these are, reputable sources, not Bob in his garage defining civil war, which is what I always tell my students. When you're online and you're using things online for papers, for research, know where you're getting them. The National Archives, the Library of Congress, not Bob in his garage. So anyway, these all fall into the category of like Merriam-Webster or, a dissertation on this topic or whatever else. But at any rate, some say that a civil war is, and I'm quoting now, a high intensity conflict often involving regular armed forces that is sustained, organized, and large scale. Yeah, we're not in that. Some say a civil war is a war, and that word too is kind of key, between opposing groups of citizens of the same country. That's pretty sweeping. I would say still the word war, before you apply that, you should think about that. Some would say, you don't see civil war until you see mass mobilization of, in this case, this is a quote, of sectarian communities behind more or less conventional armies. Again, that's not what we're seeing it. So there's a spectrum of definitions of what a civil war is. Another one, actually, I'll just toss out there, is a civil war is an attempt to grab power at the center of government or in a given region, or to use violence to change some major government policy. All of these things, in one way or another, we can poke or prod or use. But the fact of the matter is, first of all, the reason that people are really debating this is because the phrase civil war has a really deep, profound, potentially dangerous meaning, right? So all of this conversation I found online about the precise meaning of civil war, the reason people are bothering is because it matters when you apply it. So that goes back to my earlier point. Now, I try to think in American history of other moments when people were really agitated about a word and the implications of the word. The first thing that came to mind for me, and at that point too, there was talk about it, but the first thing that came to mind for me was actually the word party, as in political party. If you look at correspondence, Federalists to Federalists and Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans to Jeffersonian Republicans, particularly on the Republican side, I think there's actually a Jefferson letter to Madison. I didn't look it up beforehand, but so I can't date it, but I'm going to say like 1793 or something like that. He says to Madison, "They dare to call us a party." Now, we look back at this time period, we're like the Federalist Party and the Republican Party. Sometimes people use that badge, but the word party had a lot of baggage attached to it, right? A party, in the understanding of that time, was basically an organized group of people seeking to promote themselves, not the common good, themselves. Parties, in that sense, particularly on a national level, were potentially a really bad thing. You don't want to be called a party, right? You want to be assuming that you represent the people, which is pretty much what the Jeffersonian Republicans said was, we represent the will and the idea and the interests of the people, and the Federalists do not. That's far better than you're a party. So just the word party, you find people saying all kinds of interesting things about it, because at least for a time, they don't want to be called a party. There's too much baggage attached to that. Now, again, think about us looking back, and even without thinking about it, saying, yeah, party, it should make you think, particularly if you're a historian, you should think about, wait, what am I assuming there? That was at the core of actually my first book, was the question I asked myself. I didn't even get, when I started, to the level of words. I just asked myself, what if I don't assume that there are parties in the 1790s, but I just look and see what's there and see what it looks like, and then draw a conclusion, which sounds really obvious, but it wasn't, right? Because the whole world was party systems, the first party system, blah, blah, blah. So that was my question. What do they think's going on? And let's not assume parties are there or a system is there until I see it. And lo and behold, I did not feel that I saw parties in the way that I understand what they are, and it definitely wasn't a system, right? So all of a sudden, this blanket phrase that's hiding things and assuming things was covering over a lot of what was actually going on ground level. That's something that, Jefferson was outraged that he dared be called a party. On the part of the Federalists, they were, I'm sure, deliberately applying that label, right? Oh, they're a party. They're just a group of people out for, loaves and fishes, out for themselves. Harumph, harumph, harumph. So even a simple word like that can be coded, has implications, and can be really charged and have an impact. Another word that today people use when they're referring to history, that in ways that I'm not even going to have to describe, has meanings attached to it that are inaccurate, become very diplomatic sometimes. Sometimes people like to talk about, quote unquote, when they're looking back earlier in America, white slavery. What they mean is indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is not slavery, right? So if you're calling that slavery, you're making all kinds of statements, intentionally or not, about Black slavery and white slavery, excuse me, and how lots of people were enslaved, and it wasn't just Black people, it was white people too. Indentured servants, generally speaking, have an indenture, a term of service for which they serve. Now, a lot of indentured servants were treated really badly, but they weren't enslaved. They weren't slaves. It wasn't a system of slavery. So that's a word which, again, it would be easy for some to use that and say, oh no, but they were being treated badly and punished, and they didn't have a lot of rights. Yeah, but it was an indenture for a limited amount of time, and it was a whole different mindset and a whole different idea of servitude than slavery. So there's a word that seemingly means something that can be warped in a variety of different ways. Terrorism, as I mentioned at the outset, is another one. I do think when Americans use terrorist or terrorism, they tend to assume, or at least not some Americans, that means foreigner, right? Terrorists are foreign people, people in the United States who behave like that are dangerous loners. And again, is a terrorist a single individual? Is it someone acting for a group? I didn't actually plunge in, and will not plunge into, what terrorist or terrorism means, but the use of that word matters as well. I've used before a quote from John Adams when he was writing to Jefferson in his old age, and he talks about some of what was happening on the streets in the late 1790s, when Americans were very upset about France and whether America, was for or against France, and Federalists and Republicans were in the streets angry at each other. And Adams says, this is almost a direct quote, "What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson?" Right? That's his brand for that, is people in the street who are upset and are protesting. Now, one could argue about whether that's terrorism or not, and you would have to plunge in a little bit more as to what was actually happening and as to what John Adams thought was happening, and how those things bump up against each other, and how Adams's federalist discomfort with mass politics in the street might have fed into that. But he writes this long letter to Jefferson. Actually, it's right in the middle of this letter. I didn't even see it. What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? So I got the quote exactly right. But he has this list. And he says when he starts out, this is so John Adams that I have to share it with you. He says, okay, terrorism. We're going to talk about terrorism. Upon this subject, I despair of making myself understood by posterity, by the present age, and even by you. To collect and arrange the documents illustrative of it would require as many lives as those of a cat. You never felt the terrorism of Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts. I believe you never felt the terrorism of Gallatin's insurrection in Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion. You certainly never realized the terrorism of Fry's rebellion. Most outrageous, riot and rescue, as I call it, treason. Rebellion, as the world and great judges and 2 juries pronounced it. And he goes on, you never felt this terrorism, you never felt that terrorism. He lists a lot of things that happened in the 1790s as terrorism, and then goes on to say domestics and friends came to his house, the presidential mansion at that time, to protect him because they didn't know what was going on in the street. And so he basically says in an Adams kind of a way, that was terrorism and they were against me. And then he backs away in a sort of more balanced way and says, if I were summoned as a witness, which party had excited Machiavelli, his word, the most terror, and which had really felt the most, I could not give a more sincere answer than in the vulgar style, quote, put them in a bag and shake them and then see what comes out first. So in the end, he says, both sides were inflicting that kind of terrorism on the other. Both sides were feeling it. That's his definition of that word. Again, we would need to do some historical contextual thinking to get at, first of all, what he is assuming, and then some careful contextualizing to be careful that the way we're using that word doesn't impose a lot of modern assumptions on the use of that word. I will say I looked up one other thing, thinking that it would be another example of this, and it isn't, but I want to share it with you only because I didn't know this beforehand. So when I was thinking of words to talk about and how one word or another makes a difference, one thing I thought of, this isn't what I was about to mention, one thing I thought of was the Federalists in the constitutional debate and the anti-Federalists, right? Federalist is a message. Anti-Federalist is not the most strategic framing, right? One says, we're for this, and the other side says, we're against that. That was not strategic naming. But what I was thinking of and what I wanted to see when the first time it was applied was the Quasi-War in the United States between 1708 and 1800 with France. It was never a fully declared war. It's, as far as I know, always used in scholarship, modern scholarship, for quite some time, as it's called the Quasi-War. So when I was thinking about this episode, I said, that feels to me like it's either going to be something that dates all the way back, or it's going to be something modern that scholars applied. Lo and behold, I was wrong on both ends. So I did a various searches, and the earliest use I could find of Quasi-War is actually 1802. It's 2 years after it ended. And what's interesting is it's in a pamphlet. It's talking about what happened, and it says something like, the Quasi-War, as it is often styled. So they're still playing with the term. They're still trying to decide what to call it. And it's still a little new, so it was worth putting that way. But that was interesting to me, right? That would, if I were studying this, I would go from that to see who's saying it and why they're saying it and how they're using that phrase and what it suggests about how people are now thinking about and processing and deploying that war, even just a few years after. Because there might be interesting political implications to that. And that is not something I knew before. So I give that to you. Okay, I see that I'm almost out of time here. I want to, here we go. Oh, here we go. Okay, so I just want to conclude by sort of zipping around back to where we started. We are and have been for quite some time in, among other things, a war of words. And they're being used really strategically and often very effectively. Raid is a word that even the mainstream press sometimes is using. That's really problematic because of the implications that go along with it. Like this was some illicit kind of thing, that, well, not really, right? But legally executed search warrant does not have zing. Other things now, other words now that really mean almost nothing, but they're being dropped in conversations and thus mean nothing. Think of critical race theory, which now means everything, right? If you are angry about anything concerning race, you just throw that into a sentence, right? Oh, they're teaching critical race theory. Well, no, they're just talking about race and slavery, but sure. So there's a word that, looking back, historians in the future looking back will have many interesting things to say about the evolution of that idea and how that word is being strategically used in rhetoric to stir up emotions and bring people together. Woke is now doing the same thing, right? If something is bad, if people on the right think something is bad, then they say woke, it's woke. Now that first of all, that word started out really more in Black parlance than white parlance. And now not only has it been taken over, but it's been totally changed in meaning and made into something bad, right? It now in essence means nothing but bad, right? Crazy liberal bad, kind of like critical race theory, crazy liberal bad. And that is a practice that goes all the way back too, right? There's a, I want to say in like 1799, I remember seeing a letter from one Federalist to another, and this is going to be a bad paraphrase. He says something, this one Federalist to another, like, never use the word aristocrat if you're in front of the public. Never. Because if you drop that in conversation, you're lost. It's going to be aristocrats, which now is kind of like elites, right? Just don't say aristocrat because there's too much attached to it and you've defeated your cause as soon as that comes out of your mouth. So, obviously, I'm not claiming that what's going on now is unique or new. What I am saying is in ways that are easy to miss, particularly when the mainstream media adopts words like raid, it really, really becomes important to think about the baggage, the political and cultural baggage that goes along with those words, whether or not they were meant to be put on that statement by the mainstream media, it comes along with it, right? So we need to be word detectives. We need to not only look at and think about propaganda and what they're really aiming for, but even in a more sweeping way, see how things are being described, see the words that are being applied to things, and when possible, take a breath and just see what it suggests. Raid irked me really early on because it suggests somehow that something illegal happened, which it didn't. And that's an important distinction. And that can be a playing point, right? No, it was a raid. It was bad and it was violent or whatever goes along with the assumption of the word raid. It has a specific meaning and then it has a meaning in the way that it's now being used. Really have to think. Again, I'm not only the right is really good with this kind of wordplay. But I will say that Nazi, pointing to people on the right and saying that they're Nazis, is an example of the same thing. But the right has been doing this really, really, really effectively. And it's a hard battle to win, right? Because the word is out there and you end up being in the anti-federalist position, right? They're like, raid, and you're like, no, not a raid. It's difficult, right? It's you really have to think about how to get around that, and it's hard. It's hard. A language war is a difficult war to fight because in a way no one controls words, and people who do control words or who want to control words are already in a bad place. Right? We're already moving away from democracy if you're not allowed to say critical race theory or not, whatever. You need wordplay and word wars. Yubi is very upset at this too. Thank you, Yubi. That's it. Those are difficult, subtle powerful and important modes of combat. And we just need to be very aware of the fact that that's ongoing. We may not be in a civil war, but we're in a word war. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to think about what that means. Okay, I see mug. You guys are so quick. You can tell, I guess, kind of by the tone of my voice. I'm like shifting in. Okay. So did Newbie just wake up Ellen's dog? I don't know what prompted him, but he's now head bobbing. So he really loved that message. Okay, so the mug, wiping off lipstick. It's not a stretch exactly, but it requires an explanation. And if there's any folks there that are new, every week for 123 weeks, I have or almost every week, I have a mug that relates in some way to the topic being discussed. So first off, on the cuff, on the surface, it says on caffeine, which may not mean anything. However, it's from the On the Media radio program on NPR, right? It says On the Media. So actually, this is my mug making a statement about the fact that the words that media use matter. This is my words matter mug, and they put caffeine on there, not the word that we're talking about, but it is a program that does just what we're talking about. I haven't listened to it in a very long time. I used to, and they would very much do things along the lines of what we're doing here, which is trying to think about how things are being described, how things are being talked about or not being talked about. So that is my thematic mug.
That's a good mug.
I haven't used this one either before or very much. So I was proud.
I don't remember it.
No, I was very proud that you know,
there is a mug spreadsheet, so I'm sure somebody's going to fact check us in about 5 seconds.
Yes,
I don't remember that one.
Yes, no, I couldn't either.
Big mug. I like that mug.
It's a good mug. Yeah,
that's a good mug.
Okay.
So we've had several cartoon pitches in the chat, Joanne. They want to do a remake of the Magic School Bus, sort of like, but you're Miss Frizzle and Newbie is your sidekick, and Carolee and her students are on the bus, and you're all going to be word detectives.
Wow. Okay. See, I don't know
that idea to see.
I don't know that show. I think I'm too old to know that show, but if Newbie's my sidekick, I'm okay.
Yeah, Miss Frizzle was kind of this character. She wore crazy clothes and she drove a school bus that could fly and go into the ocean. It had all these adventures with kids, and it was popular in, like, I don't know, the 90s, early 2000s. But anyway, it's a big compliment in teacher circles. All right, we've got great questions lined up, starting with our friend Rich. He said, Barbara Fields famously said near the end of the Civil War docuseries on PBS that the Civil War is still going on and it can still be lost. And he wondered if you would comment on that.
Well, that's a really interesting example of what I just said. I think if you're speaking generally as Civil War as a kind of broad cultural, political worldview kind of war that came out, was acted out in one way in the 1860s, I suppose you could say that there are many of the same issues in a slightly different form that are, you know, to the current day being argued over. We're still arguing about race. We're still arguing about the rights of Black people in American society. We're still arguing about many of the things. We're still arguing about federalism. We're still arguing about states' rights. If I said that, if I were, and it's very possible when you're doing a TV documentary and you speak for they ask you questions for 2 hours, and by like hour 1.5, you don't even know what you're saying anymore. That's where all the footage comes. TV show. So it's possible in hour 1.5, I might say, well, the Civil War never ended. And then I would be angry at myself and would have wanted myself to say, and by that I mean, so the idea that she's suggesting there, yeah, I totally can see that. And even to the degree that those topics and things remain like a third rail and are still tinged with violence, right? You could say that in a lot of different ways. It also makes me think about Heather's book. Why, I'm going to get the title wrong, about, someone can get it there. How the South. Sorry, Heather. Someone get it for me about the South.
How the South. The chat went by too fast. It was in there.
Okay. how the chat won the war, whatever that is.
How the South won the Civil War.
Okay, so that's suggesting it's over and the South won. But at any rate, this is in a sense an example of what I was talking about in my comments. Civil war is a loaded word and it can mean a lot of different things. And when you use it, you should be clear about which thing you mean. And if you're pointing to what's going on today and just saying, yeah, we're in a civil war, I think on the one hand, that's dangerous. On the other hand, it's lazy and covers up the ugliness of what's really going on.
You used that mug on May 21st of 2020, by the way. Because of course, clearly has a spreadsheet for every mug.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. What? But only once before in 123 episodes. So,
yep, that's pretty good. Okay, this one comes from our friend Miranda. It says, why aren't news folks talking about the Presidential Records Act of 1978, which is what she thinks the warrant is under? And rather than making it seem like it's a huge scandal.
Right. Well, that's a question I have been asking too, which is why is the mainstream media framing the argument around Braid, right? Why aren't they talking about the justification for it, the legality of it, the things that make that possible? Just as you're saying, what's supposed to happen with presidential records? Why aren't they actually talking about the things that make it clear that this was wrong, right? Like I was reading something, I'm not even remember what it was this morning. I was reading a lot of things this morning preparing for this, but I think one of former President Trump's lawyers said something like, well, I mean, when you're leaving the presidency, like it's chaos and things go all over the place and you never know what goes where. And it's perfectly possible that you might leave with boxes of classified documents. I'm sorry, I can't go down that road. But there's a case in which, they didn't say boxes of classified documents. They were just like, papers go everywhere. This sort of thing could happen to anybody. If the media was being very clear about the fact that, no, actually, this is what's supposed to happen. This is what normally happens. This is what the law says has to happen. People wouldn't necessarily, everyone would not necessarily want to believe that, but if that were out there and people understood that, that would certainly be useful. And I wish that that was part of the center of the argument rather than the word raid, which I haven't read, I haven't looked around to see whether we've managed to migrate off of that word yet, but and so here's the thing. Gloria says Merrick Garland used the word raid and he authorized. I have a real problem with that. I can't remember if he used the word raid, but I will trust you that he did. I think there's a problem with that. I do. I'd have to go back and listen to see if he did. But if he did, I don't think that's a good thing. And you're right, he authorized it. I think that word has baggage. And I think the baggage masks what it actually was. That's me.
I'm writing that down. Okay, so Dale says our friend Dale is down near the Williamsburg, Jamestown area. He says, thinking of early Jamestown, didn't some indentured servants of color end up in slavery? When you made that distinction earlier.
Well, that certainly right. There was a late 17th century period. There's a book by Tim Breen and Stephen Innes called, I always call it Miney Oni Groundy. It's MYNE, Mine Own Ground. A short book, but it's talking about this moment in particularly Virginia in the late 17th century when slaves and slavery, there was still a little bit of slippage. And it's after that point that things came down hard on what slaves could and couldn't do. And so if I remember correctly, that book talks a little bit about this, like, enslaved people could go to court for a certain period, and testify in court, and at past a certain point, it was like, bonk, no, it can't happen. And the point of the book is kind of like many other things that we talk about here, that this history doesn't proceed in this way, right? History does this. And that's an example of the fact that it wasn't as though things have always been bad, 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 that there was a moment when it was a little more nuanced, not necessarily good, but nuanced.
Hmm.
Um,
All right. This one comes from Julia. It says, on topics of words matter.
I
thoughts
do
on-
want to say RAID was not used in the Attorney General's statement, so I want to be clear that I'm right.
Yeah.
Not that I'm right, that I'm right in saying that I'm saying the right thing. Put it that way. Okay.
Yep. Tim always has like the links to back it up. That's what I
You
love.
guys are quick. You're always quick. Yeah.
All right. So Julius says, on the topic of words matters, what are your thoughts on swearing in political speeches? I think the one in Texas is maybe what she's referencing this past couple of days.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question. So I like everyone else, I think I had talked about Beto and Texas. I assume that's part of what we're talking about. And I'm not going to talk about him or his campaign or anything else, but I am going to talk about this moment. So, you know, it makes me think about the last chapter of my most recent book, in which people who have been playing by the rules, trying to be civil, holding back even though they're angry, kind of feeling that they are responsible for institutional order. In the handful of years before the Civil War, some people some Republicans basically decide, yeah, we're done. Like we're in the mix. We're going to play a rougher game. And they stand up in Congress and say, you know, we're a different kind of Northerner. Actually, this tends to be the language that they use. And when that happens, you can feel in correspondence from Northerners writing to their members of Congress, you can feel a sort of visceral, yes, like it's about time. And that was what I felt emanating from that moment, right? The people were like, finally, someone who'll fight. It felt the exact same as the letters and things that I was writing about after the Northerners had been very civil and institutionally correct for a long time. So the dynamic of that and why it got so much attention, I think, is partly that. And because of that, talking about baggage, it has a deeper meaning than the fact that Beto said, you know, used an obscenity. No, Tom, I haven't, and I'm not going to say it right now. You guys are always trying to get bingo off of me. It's now being talked about for the, you know, the obscenity. It's an obscenity. I think NPR did a story that got me so irritated. You know, is it good for candidates to use obscenities in front of children? Really?
Well, there was a principal fired for reading a kid's book that had the word "but" in it, and he lost his job.
Right. So, well, and that's a whole different level of word warfare. Yeah. But as far as this particular word, you know, I understand and had that emotional response to that moment because it felt like something that has felt so overwhelmingly wrong, which is belittling or ignoring what happened in that school shooting, that finally someone on the left stood up and said, you know, knock it off. That's really not funny, dude. It felt good to see that happen. So personally, I'm going to say something that's really going to get me in trouble. So this ties in, and I thought about this morning, and I'm going to explain it. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about civility in politics, right? We need to get civility back. Civility is important. We need civility in politics. No one's behaving in a civil manner. And I thought about that debate, obviously, with the word that was used by Beto in Texas. And I was once, I was in a car, I was being driven somewhere for some event, and I was being interviewed by some radio station about civility. There was a period at which civility was the topic of debate. And I said something like, you know, I think civility is a word that has many meanings. There's a spectrum of what we might call civility. And so do I think we should all be absolutely civil at all times? Well, I don't know. Was it civil to refuse to sit in the back of the bus? Was it civil? You know, was Rosa Parks being civil? You could say no, right? She refused to abide by what happened. That's, in some ways, you could say, you know, like people who are in the street protesting and refuse to get out of the street. Are they behaving in a civil manner? I don't think that's necessarily not being civil, but I think branding everything that crosses a certain point as uncivil does an injustice to forms of protest, some of which might not, and I'm not speaking in favor of violence at all. I am just saying that incivility, like I just said in this episode, you need to think about what you mean when you're saying something, people are being uncivil. If what you mean is someone said something really personal and nasty in a speech, we could talk about that. Here, I see Rosa Parks refused to do it politely, even if she was polite about, you know, oh, she refused to do it politely. I see what you're saying, that she was polite in refusing to do it. Right. And that's my point, is that you could look at any form of protest, and we've talked about protest before. I might swing back around to it. Who knows? Because this is related to that too. The idea that some forms of protest mean people get in the way and people are angry and that's visible and it upsets some people. The word civil does not always apply well to those situations. The thing that made me think, and the reason I mentioned the car and my saying was Rosa Parks being civil by refusing to go to the back of the bus, is that the person driving the car heard that conversation and refused to charge me for the ride because he said, I like what you said, which then made me stop and think about the deeper meaning of what I said. It has a deeper meaning. So I'm not interested in deciding what is or isn't civil in a specific way now, because boy, we could have a real argument about that. That's not my intention. But what I am saying is branding something uncivil is problematic, and that you need, again, to think about what you're saying and contextualize it. And that word now, in some ways, civility and uncivility, that's become kind of a buzzword, right? That I see. I haven't read very much about the Beto incident. I just saw the NPR story this morning. Like, is it good to use bad words? And I was like, really? Like, that's the thing we're going to talk about right now? And that's the thing that comes out of what happened there. But at any rate, it's a similar point to what I made throughout this episode, which is, this is like the most obvious thing to say in the world, but words matter. And even something simple like that, you're not being civil. We've seen that debate, right? People standing outside a restaurant chanting at someone in the restaurant. You are being horrible and uncivil. Well, we could talk about that and what that means. We could have a discussion, but you can't just assume that. You have to talk about it. You have to acknowledge the fact that protests can take many forms and that they're not all equal. And they can't all easily just be stamped uncivil. Civil disobedience.
And we're having a talk about that in the chat right now. People are throwing in the throw links there.
Yes.
All right, this one comes from Gloria. She asked, is the word white supremacist and its use the same as, would you put the same category as critical race theory and RAID?
Well, I say that depends on how it's being used, right? There is such a thing as critical race theory, but that phrase now is being used to mean everything and anything. There is such a thing as white supremacy. As far as I know, most people are using that to mean that specific thing, but if people were using that to apply to something that wasn't related to that, then that might be similar. So my point isn't that critical race theory doesn't exist. It's the way that phrase is being used that's the problem. It does exist, just like white supremacy exists. The question is, how's it being used? And what are the implications of that? And what is the person using it trying to do? And is it accurate or not? So if you're just randomly saying everybody is white supremacist, just like saying, people are Nazis, you have to think about what you say before you say it. Doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to decide to say that, but you need to think about how you're using these words.
All right, people are asking about, does the word civil mean people, or does it give the term some sort of dignity?
Well, I mean, I think it has different meanings, right? So the civis, the people, civic does mean of the people, but I think civility is behaving well among the people, right? I think this is one of those cases. Well, this is another case in which words, man, all the things that make it wonderful to be a writer, like sometimes I literally will be like, this is my chance to use this word. I remember in my most recent book, and I would copy down, I had a list of like words someday that I'd get to use. And this word I had read somewhere, and it was the word bridled. Someone said something to someone else that he didn't like, and that person bridled. And I was like, that's a cool word. And I don't think I've ever used that word. I want to use that word. And somewhere in the middle of the field of blood, it appears. And I was like, this is the moment. This is all part of the same argument, which is I can't be here and say never, yes, you should or shouldn't say something, but there are some things you really don't want to say. There are some things that you need to think about whether you want to say it. There are some things that are really aggressively unacceptable to say. But you need to think about all these things. We need to think about the words that we are using and the words that other people are using, because they carry baggage, and you might want that baggage to be there, but you need to reason your way to that rather than thoughtlessly using language.
Yeah. Dale was wondering what kind of swear words were used by politicians in the early republic.
Well, this is, I might have mentioned this one already, but it's the first thing. You could tell the smile on my face. The first thing I already had an example come to mind. This was, well, puppy is a good one, but that was an insult more than a swear word. The one that still surprises me was from someone's notes of a meeting related to the election of 1800, in which someone was trying to get someone to support Thomas Jefferson for the presidency. And in the course of this guy saying, why the heck would I do that? This guy's never supported me before. He uses the phrase, and I will speak it the way he wrote it. Kiss my A and go to H. Like 1799, 1800.
Wow.
Who knew? Right? And it's a reminder of something, which is if you think about yourself, you write and you speak generally in different ways. I will say that my writing very often to me sounds like I speak. And when I was doing the spoken version of the book, I was reminded of that. I was like, oh, this is very easy for me because it sounds like me. But when you're looking back at a time distant in the past, like the 18th century, it's a reminder that we hear those voices through what they wrote. And someone taking note on a conversation and having that, he said, kiss my A and go to H. It's like, oh, that's not a phrase that I would have put in anybody's mouth in 1799. A reminder that people are sometimes saying things in ways that we wouldn't have imagined, and way earlier, that there were probably other things that seem exceedingly modern coming out of people's mouths. And that would be true throughout history. And I love that, right? I will say, as a historian, I hadn't thought about this till this moment. I'm hyper word focused, right? Like my first book, when I was writing about the election of 1800, I began to notice that a lot of people were using, actually, this is quite related, to describe the election of 1800, they were using either the word anarchy a lot or civil war a lot. And so I began just taking note every time I saw one or the other. And I still have somewhere these index cards just listing like the date, the letter, and the words again and again and again, so that I ended up with multiple cards. And once I had enough cards, I was like, okay, now this is now a thing. Like, this is something they're saying, and it's weird and interesting. Why are they saying civil war over and over and over again? Okay, well, that tells you something about what they're thinking, because it's the word that a lot of people are choosing to use. As a historian, sometimes word choice can be amazingly revealing. That said, you can't read one word used in one place and draw big sweeping conclusions from it, but it can certainly lead you to ask questions about the person who wrote it down, and then lead you to ask bigger questions about whether other people are using it as well. Because sometimes that another example, I know we're running out of time, but this was just recent. So I, needless to say, I won't say that I don't know every word of every Hamilton letter, but I'm very familiar with those letters. And I was writing something, and I was writing about Hamilton's the first letter we know of from him when he was about 14 years old, in which he writes to his friend Edward Stevens, who's in Scotland, and says, you know, my ambition is prevalent. I wish there was a war. It's this early letter that's like so him, like, I got to get out of here. I want to achieve great things. And there's a sentence in there that says, when the projector is constant, we have known such things to succeed when the projector is constant. I think that might actually be the exact phrase. Neddy, we have known such things to succeed when the projector is constant. Now, I took that to mean projector, meaning mechanical, you know, like the projector is constant, like when the force is constant, these things can succeed. But I looked up the word projector just because I thought, well, that's actually an interesting word. And at the time, it was more like a person pushing. Projector was more, if the person is constant, if the person keeps pushing, it might succeed. And that slightly shifted the meaning of that statement to me, because then suddenly, oh, he's actually kind of talking about himself in a way that I hadn't thought about. And then I had to sit down and rethink. Now that's a really basic, simple example. But again, I've probably read that letter hundreds of times to the point that I can now quote sentences without looking at the letter. But I just hadn't thought about that word, right? So in relation to what I'm saying today, as a historian, it's always good when you find words that you think are interesting to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, because the Oxford English Dictionary often will list how words were used throughout moments in time, so that you could say, well, in the 18th century, this is how the word was used. And I thought it meant this, but no, actually it means something very different. I find that fascinating, that words are like a way of getting at the unconscious. The words that people use are like a way of getting at someone's level of potentially unconscious thought or strategic thought. Either way, you're looking at a word that someone chose to use, and you need to think about what that meant. That was a long disquisition on words, but clearly I find this fascinating. And as a historian, some historians just aren't excited by this tool, don't use it as much. I'm obviously like hyper interested in it because for that reason, that sometimes if you read something closely or differently, new things jump off the page, even if it's just because of the choice of a word.
I just thought of a new game show for you, Joanne. It's you and Lin-Manuel Miranda, and there has to be a celebrity host, and they throw out Hamilton quotes, and one of you has to buzz in first and say which Hamilton letter it was from.
I might
Everybody in this chat would watch that.
Right. But here's the exact quote from Tim. My folly makes me ashamed and beg you'll conceal it, yet Neddy, we have seen such schemes successful when the projector is constant. I was pretty close.
Yeah. That'd be a great show, Joanne. You should pitch that.
Well, you know, that was my experience of seeing the play Hamilton for the first time. I sat in the audience and said, 1792 to James Madison. I was just like, I knew
checking yourself.
I knew all the documents, right? And I turned to my friend. I was like, they're actual letters being quoted, and I can tell you which ones they are. Yeah, it was interesting. Anyway, I see that we're a little over time. So I will say what I want to say here at the end of this portion of our time together. As ever, thank you for coming together here on a Friday morning to, in one way or another, engage in the conversation of democracy, to talk about what's going on around us, to talk about its implications, to empower each other to think about it and act intelligently in this moment, and to just be a community coming together at a time of multiple crises to figure out the moment and what makes sense to do, right? In all of these ways, this is a really not just healthy, but important thing that we do, which is why it has lasted 123 weeks. So thank you all for yet again coming and joining in this moment. Now, what will happen now is we are now going to move to the after party. And what that means, if you have joined us through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through the NCHE website at the link ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you will be in the after party. If you are already here through that link, just wait right here and poof, you will be in the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording. We will be talking about whatever we want to talk about. But because we won't be recording, we could be a little freer in what we're saying, and we can talk about other things, right? That's it literally is an after party. So at any rate, I hope many of you will join me. If you are not going to join me, then I will see you in a week. Lately, my topics have come early because I get mad. If it's coming on a Tuesday, it means I got really peeved. Someone said last week, like, how did it come on a Tuesday? And I don't think I answered, but the answer is something really ticks me off. And then I'm like, okay, that's my topic.
Good.
So anyway,
Laughing because Ellen in the chat, when you said we were going to the after party, Ellen goes, now we can curse.
yes. And now you can.
I put the link, Joanne, to one of my favorite backstory episodes that I could never, ever use with students. Do you want to guess which
Vicinity
episode? The one about the history of cursing. I think it's called Bloody Hell or something.
Yes. Oh no.
That is one of my all-time favorites.
Let's talk about that in the after party because I do want to talk about that. But at any rate,
Great episode.
everybody, thank you for coming. Have a good week. And I will see you next week. And Annie, as ever, thank you so much, particularly you're not feeling well, for being here and being the all-important partner in crime who I profoundly appreciate.
My pleasure. And it did cheer me up. I do feel better.
Excellent. Excellent.
All right, John, you know what to do.